Hello everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today, we're looking at these two passages, not grateful for help and always harboring resentment. These two are obviously misdeeds that will bring about misfortune in a person's life. And we'll take the first one first, not being grateful for help. I'm sort of sure most of us can understand that this is not being grateful, not being thankful for kindness or support that's been received from the people around us. Now, why might that happen? I'm sure most of us here would always be grateful. How could it be that some people don't feel grateful or don't even think about how they might have benefited from the efforts of others? Well, I have sort of three reasons here. I'm sure you may think of others. The first reason might be that a person might have come to take such help or support for granted. It's, their friend, their family has always helped them, and they don't feel that they need to reciprocate or even say thank you. They might even come to expect such help or support. They might say, well, so-and-so is my friend, so they should help me. Of course they must help me. No feeling of gratitude there. And, the final scenario would be where that favor or help was given maybe a few weeks ago or a few years ago. So, it's been long forgotten. And so a person might not even bother to feel grateful anymore, if they ever did. These are some of the reasons why a person may not be grateful for help. It seems so obvious, right? It's almost natural to say thank you, at the very least, in response to someone who has helped us in some way. Then if we can see in the next slide, this comes from a white paper prepared by the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California, Berkeley. And it sort of draws our attention to the fact that actually gratitude, the practice of gratitude, is not just something that is sort of highlighted in the Exalted Treatise, but in fact many of the world's faiths, religious traditions, as listed here, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all encourage cultivating gratitude as an important moral virtue. And of course, gratitude has also been spoken about, emphasized by, ancient thinkers. For example, the Roman philosopher Cicero, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, he said that gratitude is not only the greatest virtue, it's the mother of all other virtues. So gratitude is right up there. It's really important. About 100 years after Cicero, there was the Stoic philosopher, Seneca, and in his times, he was sort of Rome's leading intellectual. And he would rank ungrateful people, even worse than criminals. Probably thinking, should be that bad. Then they list out two Scottish philosophers from the 18th century. First is David Hume, who wrote that of all crimes that human beings are capable of committing, the most horrid and unnatural is ingratitude. It certainly gives us food for thought there. Why being ungrateful could be unnatural, so horrible. And the philosopher and political economist Adam Smith believed that gratitude was vital for maintaining a society based on goodwill. So we can see how important this cultivation of gratitude is. But you might say, well, what exactly? We said before, it's this feeling of being thankful for something, some benefit that somebody else might have helped us with. Well, I've come across this helpful definition. And in this book called The Gratitude Project, it was published in a couple of years ago, in 2020. And this definition was developed by Robert Emmons, who is a professor of psychology and sort of recognized around the world for his work on a sort of scientific research on gratitude. And his definition here is involves two parts to it. The first is what is gratitude? It involves an affirmation of goodness. So where a person is able to identify that they've received some goodness, some form of goodness. It could be some help, some form of support from others, obviously, and they're able to recognize that. So they can appreciate the value of that help or support. Obviously, it doesn't mean just because that they can identify and recognize such goodness, it doesn't mean that their life is perfect. Doesn't ignore that they have problems, hassles, etc. But they're able to identify goodness in their life, and not only that, they're able to recognize where that goodness comes from. It's goodness that is, originated from something beyond our own efforts, beyond ourselves. So gratitude sort of is derived from, based on some help, some kindness, some support that has been contributed by the people around us. So in doing so, in being grateful, in affirming goodness, recognizing where that goodness actually comes from, an individual will be sort of prevented from taking things for granted. So it's quite a useful definition to keep in mind. Now, some people might say, well, being grateful is good, but doesn't it sort of lead to complacency? It makes you feel so good about yourself that, maybe you don't need to improve or do anything else. Actually, researchers have found that gratitude drives a sense of purpose and the desire to do even more. And in this book, it talks about studies that have found that people are actually more successful in reaching their goals when they consciously practice gratitude. Researchers asked people to identify 6 personal goals that they wanted to work on over a period of 10 weeks. So this is a significant period of time. And those sorts of goals could be related to their studies, could be spiritual or social or health related, like losing weight, for example. And what the researchers found was that the participants who were, they were randomly assigned to keep a gratitude journal once a week. So write about, record 5 things for which they're grateful, and do this sort of once a week. They found that those participants, others obviously weren't required to do this, but they found that the gratitude group, the people who took the time to do this, exerted more effort towards their personal goals. And not only that, they reported 20% more progress. So they put in more efforts, they achieved 20% more progress, and they reported continuing to strive still harder towards their goals. So it didn't stop them from, they didn't become complacent because they felt grateful and thankful. And so actually, the book writes that people who keep a gratitude journal consistently report feeling more energetic, alive, awake, and alert. So it sounds pretty positive. And based on 20 years of research, scientific research, gratitude has been proven to be beneficial for mental health, physical health, self-improvement, and gratitude makes us not only feel good, but also do good in our day-to-day lives. It's pretty significant. And I'd like to share with you one other study. Emmons and his other scientists found that practicing gratitude has been one of the most reliable ways for increasing happiness, life satisfaction, optimism, enthusiasm, and other positive emotions. In one study that tested different activities to boost happiness, the researchers compared writing and delivering a letter of gratitude to another person. So one group of participants would do that. Another group sort of focused exclusively just on themselves, so identifying their strengths, using their personal strengths, etc. And in the end, it was found that the gratitude group, they experienced the most benefits out of all the other participants. They reported feeling happier, less depressed after expressing their gratitude, and they continued to be that way for a full month. So these results, practicing gratitude has sort of extended results. And this is pretty positive. It gives us good reasons to practice gratitude in our day-to-day lives. But what happens in the people that they studied were pretty healthy, well-adjusted individuals. But it's been found that practicing gratitude can be helpful for people who are struggling in life. And found this particular study by Joel Wong and many others, it was published in 2016, and they looked at almost 300 adults. These are university students who sought mental health counselling. And, the many people who seek counselling at this particular university generally struggled with issues like depression and anxiety. And what they did with these, approximately 300 university students, they randomly assigned them to 3 groups. One group wrote these letters of gratitude, and this was one letter to another person each week for 3 weeks. So 3 letters altogether. Another group 2, were asked to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about negative experiences. And then the third group didn't have any writing activity at all. And as you can see here, the group that wrote these gratitude letters, and there weren't that many, 1 a week for 3 weeks, they reported significantly better mental health, both 4 weeks and 12 weeks after their written exercise ended, compared with all the others. Participants were more satisfied with their lives. They experienced, less anxiety and depression, and they were able to function better in their relationships and life overall. So, how did that work? These researchers found that by expressing gratitude, taking the time to write these letters, it sort of helped the people shift their attention away from sort of negative, very toxic emotions like resentment and envy. So, when a person writes about how grateful they are to others, how much other people have, benefited and blessed their life. There's less time to ruminate or dwell on the negative experiences. So it sounds really simple and, very, very positive. Now, you might ask, well, that sounds good, but how do we put this into practice, this practicing gratitude? Do we have to write letters as well? And the answer is, well, we could. We could even keep a gratitude journal. But I've got here some advice from a scholar official from the 11th century. And he sort of adapted Buddhist practices for Confucian scholar officials. And this was something that helped them to practice gratitude on a day-to-day basis. And these are 5 contemplations during meal times. As we all eat 3 meals a day. This is something that we can do at each and every meal. So Wang Tingjian, he would advise all scholars and officials to contemplate as follows. These are sort of 5 key points to keep in our heads. The first involves feeling grateful for, where our food has come from. The fact that it has to be grown, harvested, transported, sorted, washed, prepared, etc. All the many people, hands it took to reach our table. And, to really reflect and evaluate. Without thinking about it, it's easy to take our meals for granted. That's the very first consideration. If a person is living at home, he makes a point that they're really enjoying the good fortune of their parents, their wider family, including the ancestors, because they're enjoying the fruits of those contributions. As an official, back in the days, scholars and officials wouldn't have much time. By the very nature of their jobs, they wouldn't have time to, work the land. And so they would have to, I suppose, enjoy food and, benefit those benefits from the labors of others. So that was, all the more reason to feel grateful. That's the first consideration. First and foremost is feeling grateful for having this food. The second is a more sort of self-reflection, and it begins a self-reflection of that sort of underlies points 2, 3, 4, and 5. It says, consider one's moral character and conduct completely undeserving of such food. So, why would we not deserve our food? This is sometimes, some people might say quite a strange, haven't we paid for it? Haven't we bought it or cooked it ourselves? Well, if you think about it, in those days, each and every scholar official would have studied the classics, the books like the 4 books of Confucian learning and many other classics. And so they'd be very much across this idea of self-cultivation, cultivation of good ethical character. And if we look at the Chinese classic of family reverence that's been translated here by Henry Rosemont Jr. and Roger Ames, sort of provides us with a structure to reflect on. Our very, bodies are received from our parents. We're all born from our parents, and being careful not to injure our bodies. That's simply just the start of this practice of family reverence, where we try to repay the kindness of our parents. We're grateful for our bodies, and we respect it. We look after it. But as we grow up, we're able to contribute. We learn the skills and the knowledge to contribute meaningfully to both the family and the wider community. And as it's written here, we're to distinguish ourselves, stand out, and walk, follow the proper way, the Tao. We want to raise our name for prosperity so that people in the future might remember our good examples, and thereby, in doing so, bring honor to our parents, to our family. And it is in these acts that family reverence finds its consummation, its ultimate completion. And this family reverence begins in service to our parents, how we love and respect our parents. But it doesn't end within the family. It continues in service to our Lord in those days, or the state, the wider community, and culminates in distinguishing ourselves in the world. So when Huang Tingjian is asking us to reflect on ourselves in the second sort of matter for thought, whether we've actually done those sorts of things to deserve the food in front of us, that's what he means by that's his measure for whether one would deserve or not deserve such provisions. And then that's a self-reflection on what we've done. But what are we thinking in the moment that we're consuming our food and we're enjoying our meal? It was important, he emphasized, to protect the mind and keep oneself from misdeeds, especially, being caught up by the greed for good food. And, in his writings, he notes that in this course of one meal, we could give rise to anger, anger, and ignorance. We give rise to greed, obviously, when there is a delicious meal and we want more. When we eat to the extent of being overfull and, experience discomfort. We experience anger if the food hasn't been cooked to our preferences. We don't like what we've been served. We don't like the food, etc. And obviously that is also very ungrateful and the wrong way to think. And if we don't even turn our minds to where the food has come or feel grateful about it, then that is being ignorant. So Huang Tingjian sort of reminds us that we have to enjoy our food with the right thoughts, to try to eat with a happy and grateful heart and not to overeat. It's best to eat to about 70% full. Our bodies feel comfortable and strike a happy balance. Then the fourth consideration is being mindful of the food as therapy, because as human beings, we do need to eat and drink to function normally. People starve, die of starvation or dehydration. So it's a matter of human necessity. So that can be another helpful thought to prevent a person from being caught up in their greed for good food. Actually, he's saying at the end of the day, we eat these meals not to simply enjoy ourselves, but as therapy, almost like medicine for our the very human sufferings of hunger and thirst. And then ultimately, to accept the food, to eat for the purpose of successfully cultivating our enlightened virtue so that we can carry on. And most importantly, not just in our jobs, but to fulfill all of our duties in our various roles in the interpersonal relationships with the people around us, as sons or daughters, as brothers or sisters, as teachers or students, etc. So these are sort of 5 contemplations for scholars and officials during the meals. And it's a very tangible and practical way of practicing this gratitude on a day-to-day basis at each and every meal. So we can sort of turn our minds to these 5 considerations. Traditionally, if we were to turn back time to, say, 50, 100 years ago, there'd be almost it was a very commonplace in societies throughout East Asia to find sort of memorial plaques in homes. This was in the towns or villages, or the big cities, and the plaques would have these characters. The first character stands for the heavens, the earth, the ruler, parents, and teachers. Now, why would there be sort of plaques, at the altars in every family home? This was a custom, regardless of a person's religious beliefs. They would pay respect to these 5 sources of goodness. You could say that this was an everyday custom of practicing great gratitude to these 5 sources of goodness in day-to-day life. This is really important, so much so that almost every home, you'd say almost every home had this sort of a plaque. And why would a person have to think about heaven and earth, the ruler, parents, and teachers? Well, if you think about it, there's not one day that we live in this world where we're not sheltered by the skies. No matter how far we travel, everyone is sheltered by the heavens, and we're all supported, sustained by the earth. The earth accommodates each and every one of us, everywhere. And so it's sort of this unconditional love that we should be grateful for. Our lives, if you think about it, the climate, 4 seasons, etc. Even food couldn't be grown to feed ourselves. So hence they're sort of ranked right up there, first and second, heaven and earth, as acknowledged as source of great goodness in our life. Life would not be possible. But what about the ruler? I've changed it here to state leader, or the state generally. Well, if you think about it, without the state, without a functioning state, individuals wouldn't be able to live and work in peace. You hear about in wartime, the people, the students at school, their education is disrupted. People miss out on going to university. It just is not possible. So in a very tangible way, the fact that everything is sort of functioning means that this life of peace and stability, prosperity could be possible for individuals to go about their day-to-day life, and then for whole communities to live in harmony. So that is also a source of great goodness. So heaven, earth, and the state leader, or the state generally. And then we have parents. Obviously, the fact that we're alive is because of our parents who've given us so much throughout the course of our life. And not just in raising us, but also teachers have their hand in providing that instruction and guidance, and especially the instruction that helps us understand about our innate goodness and work towards realizing that moral excellence within all of us. So these were really important sources of goodness historically, and for many people still through to this day. They pay respects to this sort of a plaque in their homes to acknowledge day in, day out the sources of goodness and practice gratitude in that way. But what about, sometimes it can be a little bit abstract. And parents, teachers, state leaders, we certainly hear about them in the news, but it can be easy to forget about heaven and earth, etc. So within the Confucian context, we're all sort of relatively familiar with the idea of role ethics, where moral cultivation happens. And it happens in the sense of being embedded in persons' roles within their various interpersonal relationships. And as you may know, there are 5 broad categories of interpersonal relationships. You have 3, there at the bottom, 3 that arise within the family household. So the relationship between spouses, the relationship between parent and child, and the relationship between siblings. And then beyond the family, you have 2 further categories of relationship. You have the relationship between friends, and then, so that might cover classmates, colleagues as well, and the relationship between leader and team member. So traditionally would be conceptualized as the state ruler and all the subjects and subordinates. But in today's context, we could think about it as the employer, the employee, or the manager, the line manager, and all the others reporting to that manager. So there's a sort of an inbuilt hierarchy, if you like. But in each and every role that we have, these relationships involve a beneficiary and a benefactor. Beneficiary in that person being looked after or cared for, and a benefactor, the person doing the caring. So, for example, in the relationship between parent and child, obviously, when the child is very young, it's the parents who are responsible for looking after raising that child, ensuring they have education, all the basic necessities for healthy life. But as the child, it's not a sort of one-way relationship. As the child grows a bit older, they learn a bit more, they're able to help out and look after their parents as well. And certainly, as they grow up, they'll be able to contribute just as much, if not more, to the rest of the family. So they're able to be benefactors as well. So throughout our day, there'll be different situations where we're benefactor or beneficiary. So it could be at work, it could be helping out a junior colleague learn how to do something for the first time. Maybe it's their first day on the job and they haven't gone down to a particular department or office in the company before, and showing them around in terms of orientation. So at different times of the day, there are different situations where we could be either the beneficiary or the benefactor. And as a beneficiary, it's really important that we remember to practice that gratitude. Simply saying thank you, acknowledging, and ultimately remembering that kindness, to repay that kindness if we can in the future. It doesn't have to be to the same person, but to other people in need. Now, these categories help us in practicing gratitude in that way. But if you think about it on a deeper level, our moral self in the middle is sort of perfected throughout what we do in all of our interpersonal relationships. And that's sort of day in, day out throughout our lifetime. We feel grateful. And this gratefulness helps us fulfill our roles and responsibilities to others. So as a grateful child, I try to give back and do my best in contributing to the family, to my parents, ensuring that they can, I try to take care of them in as much as I'm able of and capable of, especially as the fact that they're not getting any younger. And this sort of fulfilling our moral duties, it's important for us to remember and to do so regardless of whether other people fulfill their responsibilities. We simply fulfill our duties because they're ours, and we feel grateful. Now, it also means that when we're in situations where the other person has not fulfilled it hasn't kept up their side of the bargain, it hasn't fulfilled their moral duties, well, there's no reason for us to feel resentful, or worse, carry that resentment around. That sort of goes on to the next line. And there's no reason for us to judge them, because doing so, feeling resentment, carrying that baggage around and judging others, all those negative emotions or experiences really stops us from progressing along in our moral cultivation and perfecting our moral self. So the studies earlier, the scientific studies earlier that we heard, they explained all the positive outcomes from practice of gratitude. But from the Confucian perspective, we can understand why those outcomes are brought about. Gratitude ultimately reinforces, the fact that, or the Confucian perspective, the role ethics here reinforces the fact that if a person accords with the Tao, the way that they should live, by fulfilling their various responsibilities to, all the different people in their lives, they're according with the way, then they develop humanity, essentially, this critical virtue that all human beings have within themselves, and they're realizing that moral excellence. So that is good reason why they feel, they enjoy the good fortunes of feeling healthier, good health, and really positive, meaningful relationships with all the people in their lives. So from the Confucian perspective, this role ethics, fulfilling our responsibility, moral obligations to the people around us, explain why there are positive outcomes, the good fortune to be had by practicing gratefulness or gratitude. Okay, so the next line is about not always harboring resentment. This is a misdeed. I've just explained why we shouldn't do so. Now, it's considered an even worse deed for not being grateful. And harboring resentment really means, dwelling on the shortcomings of others, complaining about that, and this often leads to saying things, doing things that hurts others. And can even, damage our relationships irreparably. So, hence, it's considered an even worse misdeed. You might remember that last week, Catherine mentioned about Yan Hui, who was Confucius's best student. And Confucius said Yan Hui was his best student because he never intensified his anger. You can remember that point. He would detect his, angry emotions, that twinge of irritation, annoyance, etc., and diffuse those angry emotions. So he could effectively prevent himself from saying the wrong things, doing the wrong things, and, hurting others. And that's really key to this idea of Confucian learning and cultivation. Remember, Yan Hui was Confucius's best student. Confucius didn't say, how intelligent he was, didn't emphasize how great he was in writing essays, arguing his point, or, being knowledgeable, broadly learned, etc. The first thing that he mentions is the reason for putting Yanhui forward as his best student is that he never intensified his anger. And he had that self-awareness to be able to correct his mistakes and not to repeat them. I mean, we're all human, we make mistakes, but Yanhui was different in that he could correct them and not repeat them. So that's part of it. Sort of this passage reminds us why it's so important to not harbor resentment. Because Yanhui did, and he was Confucius's best student. Now, there's a Chinese proverb here. It says, "Chancellor can harbor ships in their stomach." I wonder if anyone's ever experienced motion sickness before. It can be very unpleasant. But a chancellor, this is back in the days of Imperial China, this would be the highest official. This is the most successful, most accomplished government official. They're the sort of the next step down from the emperor himself. And, how can a person achieve such high excellence and success? Well, this proverb reminds us that they have this generosity of spirit. They can forgive and forget insult and injury. And it's developing this sense of tolerance, you could say, being accommodating with others, including their faults, shortcomings, etc., that can make us a better person. I'm not saying that we have to be for ourselves. A person has to be strict with themselves for their moral cultivation, but in relation to others, they have to be accommodating and intolerant. So it's the opposite approach. We can't be strict with others and lenient on ourselves. Okay, so the other thing to note is this proverb reminds us that being tolerant is obviously good for our family, our relationships with family and friends, but it can also be very positive in the work context, in our professional lives. Now, there's a really interesting story about melons, and they were grown in two states, the state of Wei here and the state of Chu in green. And this story is from Master Jia, a text attributed to Jia Yi, who was a scholar official. He lived during the first century before the Common Era. What's special about this particular text is that Jia Yi, he very much reflected on the downfall of the Qing dynasty. This dynasty here. It was a very short-lived dynasty, lasted about 15 years only, and Jia Yi, he served the Han dynasty that emerged from the fall of the Qing. And he was concerned to learn from the mistakes, what went wrong with the Qing government, and how could the Han dynasty, during his times, obviously, not his times was much later than 260 BCE, where this map was, how the Han dynasty could achieve a more sustainable government. So learning from the past. And the story itself relates to an official who was the district magistrate in an area along the border of the state of Wei, this border with the state of Chu. The magistrate was called Song Jiu. And on this border there would be a sort of a lodge for traveling officials when they're sort of visiting, making interstate, could be diplomatic visits, lodge for these traveling officials. And the officer responsible for the lodge, he was very diligent in watering the melons that grew on both sides of the melons grew on both sides of the border, but he was very diligent in watering the melons grown within his own state, the state of Wei. Because he watered them every day, really took care of them, it's no surprise that those melons grew well. There were many, they grew quickly, they were well-grown melons. Now, his counterpart in the state of Chu was lazy, didn't take care of the melons. And as a result, there were very few melons and they didn't grow very well at all. But he would look across the border and notice the well-grown melons in the state of Wei. And he felt envious, very jealous, and resentful even to the official, the officer involved. So much so that what he would do would sneak across the border at night under the cover of darkness and destroy the well-grown melons in the state of Wei. Now, clearly the officer who's taking great care of those melons is, hugely upset when he discovers the damage. And he complains, as the officer. He actually wants to take revenge by, sneaking across the border himself under the cover of night and destroying the melons in the state of Chu. But he complains to the district magistrate, Song Jiu, who I mentioned at the beginning of the story. And Song Jiu, this is his response. He said, what a terrible thing to do. How can you even say that you plan to, sneak across and destroy their melons? If you were to ask for my advice, I would say, don't make things worse and create further enmity. I would tell you to sneak over the border, during the night under the cover of darkness and water their melons for them. Okay? Don't let anyone know that you've done so. And so that's what the border officer does. Now, the lazy official in the state of Chu obviously is quite surprised. He wakes up at dawn to find that the melons are already watered. And pretty soon they start growing very well. There are many of them. They're well-grown melons. And he's so curious that he starts to investigate. How did this happen? It's not, obviously, I haven't changed. How come the melons are growing so well now? And he, naturally discovers what has been happening. The fact that his counterpart on the other side comes over every night to do his job for him, basically water the melons for him. And he's very moved by this. He feels really happy about what his counterpart in the state of Wei has been doing all this time, and he reports this to the ruler in the state of Chu. So the head of the state of Chu finds out, and he feels really moved. And he gives generous gifts to the state of Wei, to repay them for this kindness. And he thereafter seeks to develop, close relations between the two states based on mutual trust. And it's recorded that, this blossoming development, happy development in the relationship between the two states has ultimately come about because of the good advice of Song Jiu in the very first place. Right? He gives us very positive advice that stops his colleague from going over and destroying the melons in the state of Chu, and with a good advice to water the melons for them. And there's a saying in the Master Jia that says, transform, these are the melons, transform misdeed into merit, and from misfortune comes good fortune. So if you think about it, it's if the the border officer at the state of Wei, he was really upset. Fair enough. All of his good work, these melons were destroyed. If he actually sought revenge, tried to destroy the melons on the other side of the border, the relations between the two states might have deteriorated so much so that, who knows, the next World War might have happened. But just by responding with kindness, it brought about a much more positive outcomes, happier outcomes for everyone involved, between the border officers, between the states, between the states on that level as well. So just the one, not harboring resentment, can have such transformative results. Now, in the time that I have left, let me share with you one other story about not harboring resentment. In the 15th century this time, this is Ming Dynasty China, there were two officials, and I'll stop sharing the screen. One was called Jing Cheng, and he ultimately rose to be the minister of the Ministry of Justice, or the Department of Justice. But before he became so successful, he had a colleague by the name of Zhang Mazi. And the trouble with this particular colleague is that this Zhang would make life difficult for him. Basically, criticize him, disparage him, etc. We can imagine the rest. So not very nice to him at all. But one day, his colleague Zhang is accused of some misconduct and is literally arrested and sent to the capital. And on his way, he passes by Jing Cheng, and he sort of kneels down and pleads for clemency, in the hopes of, of being able to be excused from the terrible punishments that would lie in wait. It was clearly a serious crime, so much so that he had to be sent to the capital for punishment. Well, Jing Cheng was able to forgive and forget all that insult and injury, all things that happened in their past. And he worked on the case, and ultimately Zhang Mazi was able to be, had the charges dismissed. And when Zhang Mazi comes to visit him to obviously express his gratitude for saving his life, Jing Cheng remains courteous to him, as always, respectful, courteous as always, and certainly doesn't take the credit for what he did, essentially. And so between the two friends, they probably weren't friends before, but they became friends. Zhang Mazi was really moved by what Jing Cheng had done for him, but they became even closer. Zhang Mazi's daughter married Jing Cheng's son, so they ultimately became sort of extended family members. And you can see that it wasn't just the previous example involved officials and interstate relations, but by not harboring resentment can bring about that sort of positive, much more positive outcomes on the level of individuals, friends, colleagues. So from the level of the individual to the level of states, this is something to be mindful of, and something to be cautious about, not harboring resentment in what we do. So I think I'll end there on that note, on that happy note. And thank you very much for your kind attention. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much indeed.